Welcome back. This is lecture 3. In lecture 1 and 2, we have looked at the structure of the human brain mapping method, and also in the last lecture we looked at the major important milestones in language acquisition in the very first couple of years of the child's life. In lecture 3, we will look at the development of the human brain and important milestones and their possible connections with the language acquisition stages. So, the neural development as well as the language development in case of human beings, if there are some correlations that have been proposed. So, first look at the development of the human brain. So, we will look at the prenatal and the neonatal stage. So, when you talk about the prenatal stages, typically the division is in terms of trimesters, first and second and third trimester. So, we will stick to that kind of a division. In the first trimester, some very important things happen with respect to the development of the human brain. Of course, it is a long process, but for the brevity of time, we will make it simpler. By the end of the first trimester, the fundamental brain morphology and organization is already laid down. In fact, it is said that even before the mother knows that she is carrying, the brain is already getting formed. The child brain is already getting formed. So, the virtually every neuron in the nervous system has been generated. So, there are the cells will be generated, then they will be shifted, they will be transferred, then they will go to their own, then they form the different regions and so on. So, the major part of the neurons are already generated. In early stages of development, neurons will often co-express multiple transmitters and modulators, whereas single cells in human mature brain exhibit much less diversity. So, what is very interesting in case of the fetal brain is that it is it creates a large number of neurons, and eventually they will be pruned. All of that neuron will not be necessary later on. This will be cut down, this will be cleaned and so on. So, however, the majority of the neurons are created. They are also being busy doing multiple things which will not be reflected in the adult brain. So, in the initially neurons will have this is called co-expression. So, they will be they will co-express multiple transmitters and modulators. So, whereas single cells in the mature brain does not do that, they exhibit much less diversity. So, the brain not only they have large number of cells, but they also they show a lot of diversity. But what is not yet fully in place is the tail of the distribution of the last layer of the isocortex, the external granular layer of the cerebellum, and the hippocampal dentate gyrus and the olfactory bulb. So, certain parts of the brain are not yet developed, but majority of the cells, majority of the neurons are already generated. In the second trimester, this is the period in which the basic wiring of the brain takes place. First the neurons are created, then the wiring happens. So, the large patterns of connectivity will emerge in this stage. So, the second trimester typically will give us the connectivity developing between different neural regions, including the isocortex. From a developmental point of view, one of the most important events is the establishment of connections from the thalamus to all regions of the isocortex. We looked at in the beginning of this module, we looked at the structure of the brain, that the certain layers in the cortex are connecting, there is a connection from the cortex to the thalamus and then thalamus to, so input and output kind of a connection. That connection develops in the second trimester itself. Okay. And then intracortical pathways also develop. Intracortical pathway, as the name suggests, the connections from one cortical region to another cortical region. So, that also gets begin to establish the mature connectivity pattern. What it means is that the kind of connectivity pattern that you see in the mature brain already starts in the second trimester of the fetus. Now, these connections are set up in the second trimester in a pattern that very much resembles the adult pattern. So, a lot of work actually, so that you can imagine how quick and how fast the entire process of creating the brain is. So, animal studies show that visual, somatosensory, auditory and limbic areas of the cortex all receive projections fairly exclusively from those thalamic nuclei that will project to them in the adulthood. Basically, the connection between the thalamus and the cortical regions that will be visible in an adult brain are already in place during this time. The corpus callosum makes its first appearance around post conceptional day 90, that is when the corpus callosum appears. Connections between the areas of cortex and its corresponding cortex in the other side called homotropic connections, they also built up in the over the following months. So, rapid construction basically is goes on during this time. During this time, another very important thing happens, which is called apoptosis. So, this is basically a particular kind of regressive event, which is called the apoptotic neuronal death. Now, one might wonder, why do neurons die? Neuronal death is death of neurons. So, this is the very beginning of the life, this is the second trimester, when first trimester already the neuronal generation has happened, lots of neural cells have been created, actually they have been created in surplus. So, that is why this is programmed this way, this is not, it does not happen in a haphazard way, this is programmed this way that the unnecessary ones or the excess redundant neurons will be will die. That is what apoptosis refers to. This kind of developmental cell death usually occurs in close association with the establishment of major action pathways between regions. So, as the connections are getting developed, there you will the brain there are some redundant actions, there are some redundant connections which are not necessary, those will die. So, this is part of a basically removing everything that is redundant. So, removal of excess errors of axonal connections also are part of this kind of a neural death. For example, the retina establishes its connections with subcortical targets in the third month post conception in humans. It reaches the peak number of axons in the optic nerve about a month later. By the end of month 5, retinal ganglion cell loss is over, removing as much as 80% of the originally generated cell population. So, this is what we mean, because in the first trimester the cell generation happens at a very large scale and many of those cells will eventually not be necessary, they will not be needed, they are excess, so they will die, that is the process. Then another important aspect around this time is what is called the self instruction. The second trimester is also the period in which something akin to learning or self instruction begins. So, self instruction based on whatever is happening within the system itself, because this is still in utero, it is not outside in the world. So, there is no way to learn anything from the environment, but as the process goes, it is within the system some learning happens. That is what is called self instructions. It is a process of activity dependent self organization of the nervous system, that is self instruction. Okay. In utero, this means activity of the body itself or the intrinsic circuitry of the nervous system. So, as things are developing, whatever is happening there, based on that the system is learning something on its own. Activity dependent organization occupies the middle ground in the nature nurture debate. That is why this aspect is very crucial, because remember our nature part of the debate says that the human brain comes pre-processed, is all there in the very beginning, we do not need to do anything. Nurture on the other hand says that learning, environmental input and so on has a major role to play in language acquisition. Now, because we now know that thing called self instruction happens. So, this is kind of a middle path between nature and nurture, where some of the same mechanisms that will be used later for learning from outside world are used in utero to set up this basic function. Okay. So, response to the correlations in the input, which we will eventually learn. After birth we will learn, we will take input from the outside world, that mechanism gets fine tuned during this time. So, the basic infrastructure is created this time. So, the basic functional architecture of the brain is that created around that time. Okay. In utero, some of this organization activity may be imposed by the system itself. Third trimester, by the beginning of the 7th month of gestation, a remarkably large number of neural events are complete. You can see how many things happen in between already. So, reciprocal connectivity from higher order cortical areas to primary areas has also begun around this very time. Pathways exhibit the initial process of myelination as well. Myelination refers to creating the myelin sheath on the neuronal structure. So, that is connected to higher functioning capacity of the neuron and the network. So, that also starts around in the third trimester. Large descending pathways from the cortex area are also in the process of development. Aside from the more obvious role of descending pathways in motor control, the appearance of descending pathways also means that brain has started to talk back to its input regions. So, the brain has of course, various regions. So, the sensory input gets from the sensory apparatus, it goes to one particular region in the brain. From there it goes further to the cortex. So, the cortical region is not where the input comes first. That is what we mean by the talking back to the input regions, the input region and then the cortical region. So, there is a connection between these two that starts to happen around this time, the third trimester. So, a form of interaction found in all sensory as well as motor system. So, the input from the visual apparatus goes to the first domain, and from there it goes to the cortical region, visual cortex and so on. So, that is what we mean here. And finally, in the 8th and the 9th month, a massive and coordinated birth of synaptic connections begins in the isocortex and the related structure. So, the synapse all of you know that they are the connections between the between neurons. So, that synaptogenesis happens, this just coincides with the birth. Just before birth, a massive generation of synaptic connections begins. So, when the babies are born, a nervous system whose working components are all in place and organized. So, the machine is kind of, the basic architecture is already in place, all cells are generated, all major incoming sensory pathways are in place, have already undergone. So, all major incoming sensory pathways are created, all the working components are in place, already gone through a period of refinement of their total number of cells, because we have seen that the neural death also happens, pruning happens before birth already. So, the refinement has already happened, connections and topographic organization is also done, intracortical and connectional pathways are well developed, though output pathways are still lagging behind, but the input pathways are more well established around the time the baby is born. So, in essence what it means, the big cortical regions. So, primary sensory and motor regions are the most important cortical regions. They already have their adult input and topography. So, the adult brain structure has the brain at this point when the child is born, these in terms of these major areas they resemble the adult brain, that is what this means. Though we do not yet know if the multiple sub areas described for the primary cortex have sorted themselves out. So, we do not know, broadly the areas are already there, but the the more subtle multiple sub areas within this are already in place or not, that is not very clear. Thus, the brain is up and running at birth, ready to learn. So, this is primarily many things are already in place already. Postnatal changes has many important factors that happens. One of the most important is of course, the myelination. Myelination refers to the increase in the fatty sheath that surrounds the neuronal pathways. There is a layer of fatty sheath, the covering of some sort that happens there, and this surrounds the neural pathways. So, this process increases the efficiency of the information transmission between neurons. So, from one neuron to another through the network, if after myelination the process becomes far more efficient. Okay. In the central nervous system, sensory areas tend to myelinate earlier than the motor areas. So, sensory before the motor. This has very important implications. For example, this has been cited as a possible reason why language comprehension production disparity is very common in case of humans. So, for example, language, we have seen it with the word production and word comprehension. So, word comprehension starts much before word production. This is probably because the sensory areas get myelinated first and motor areas get myelinated later, that is the idea. Intracortical association areas are known to myelinate last and continue to myelinate at least into the second decade of life. So, this is not a very short time process, it goes on for a very long time. So, starting with the very beginning of postnatal life till the second decade of life. So, of course, the sensory areas get developed first, followed by motor areas, followed by the other intracortical association areas. Under myelinated connections in the young human brain are still capable of transmitting information. It is not like because the entire brain is not myelinated at that stage, they will not be able to carry out the processes, not be able to transmit the information. That is not how it works, but with myelination it becomes more efficient. So, additions to the myelin sheath may increase the efficiency, though it does not create efficiency. That needs to be kept in mind, but they cannot be the primary causal factor in brain organization of language or any other cognitive processes. Now, major till here, what are the major changes in terms of the neural structure and the language? Regional connectivity of the isocortex begins in the second trimester and although completed postnatally, but it starts in the second trimester, but it bears no direct obvious relationship with language activity except in a permissive sense. That is how it has been proposed, that even though the connections, though regional connections are already in place, but they may not be having any direct impact on the, it provides facility, it facilitates, it creates a permissive scenario for language to develop. It may not really create it. A mature reciprocal pattern from secondary to primary visual cortex is accomplished somewhere between 4 months and 2 years in developing humans. Myelination brackets a language acquisition only in the most global sense. So, myelination, though it is very important factor in case of efficiency of the information routing, but it creates a permissive environment just like any the previous one that I have discussed. So, it creates a facilitation in a global sense because it takes place somewhere between the gestation and adulthood. So, it is a large time frame, it facilitates, that is the idea. So, there is no direct impact of the changes in the neuronal structure with respect to language so far that we have seen. However, what happens after this is very important, that is our synapses. Synapses are what? They are chemical junction between neurons. It is a pathway for information sharing. These synapses are easily recognizable and countable, and as a result of which they have been studied in terms of the neural signaling. The most commonly studied synapse is the chemical kind of synapse. There are many other kinds as well. So, because it is more visible, it is easily countable. This is why it has been studied most with respect to various kinds of mental functions. But then there are other kinds of synapses. For example, there can be direct electrical coupling between cells. This is particularly prominent in the early development. Cells can communicate through the release of gases as well, most notably nitric oxide, and also by altering the extracellular milieu of the neurons surrounding them. So, there are many different idea here is that there are more than one way of communication across cells, across neurons and the networks. Synapse is of course one of the most important one and most visible one, but these are the other different kinds. Now, the idea of synaptogenesis is very important in terms of neural development. This occurs in the critical time window of early language development, the genesis of the synapse. So, first the cells are created, then synapse creation of the synapse happens the last part of the prenatal stage, and it continues for some time, and that is why it is very important. So, it seems optimally placed for the rapid statistical learning infants show in both the visual and auditory realms during this time. Okay. Synaptogenesis meaning creation of synapses. So, synapse elimination also happens around the same time. So, synaptogenesis and synapse elimination co-occur over most of early postnatal development, and they occur throughout life also. So, newer connections are created always. That is why we say that the brain is, the idea of the plasticity of the brain is basically to a large extent based on this. So, new experiences creates new kinds of networks, new kinds of connections. So, as a result of which synaptogenesis is a lifelong affair. However, normally for all this is a kind of an universal process, that in the early part of life, early part of postnatal life, the large number of synaptogenesis typically is visible, and that also co-occurs with the major milestones of language development. There are some interesting features, however, that we have to be careful about, features to synaptogenesis and elimination within the perinatal period that seem quite related to language acquisition. So, synaptogenesis and synapse elimination co-occur over most of early postnatal development, and of course, they carry out throughout your life, and there seems to be certain interesting features as well associated with this. So, synaptic connectivity is the primary means by which knowledge is represented in the brain. So, if we ask somebody, if you ask a neuroscientist what is knowledge, how is knowledge represented in the brain, in what form, the main idea is that it is stored in the form of synapses, meaning in the kind of connections that we have created in the brain that represents that knowledge. So, for example, we know for every language, many languages have this idea that when we say prices are going up, basically we mean it is more, prices are more now. So, up is more is a connection that language makes. In the neural structure as well, there is a connection between these two disparate things. So, these connections are, so this knowledge is neurally represented in terms of the synapse that is created, the connections that are made. This is what we mean when we say that knowledge is represented in the brain in terms of the synapses. This knowledge can be innate, set up by independent of experiences, it can be learned, set up by experiences, or somewhere in between, as in the above mentioned case of the prenatal activity dependence, which we have seen before. So, this is the reason for interest in the role of synaptogenesis and synaptic connectivity in the behavioral development, because this correlates with so many other things. The number of synapses is often thought of as an index for the amount and complexity of information transferred in a structure. However, there is a thing that you have to be careful about. There is a syndrome called sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. This is associated with excess number of persisting synapses in the medulla. So, even though higher number of synapses is typically taken as an indicator of better or more complex transfer of information, sometimes it may not be a good thing at all. In case of which is the case of sudden infant death syndrome, which typically is caused by the persisting synapses in the particular area in the brain. Then metabolism and synaptogenesis, there is an influential study using PET, positron emission topography. Study of human infants was carried out in resting stage. Resting stage is when you are not doing anything, when you are resting, the brain is not actively doing something, not speaking, not playing, not watching anything, resting stage. So, they are either asleep or they are sedated. In this study, it showed a marked increase in the frontal lobe metabolism starting between 9 to 12 months of postnatal age. Now, this is the age which is also crucial in terms of the language development stages. Now, this was a resting stage, as a result of which this metabolism, high metabolism, was not a response to any kind of stimulus or task. So, the authors, the scholars suggested that the sharp increase in glucose metabolism might be caused by a burst in synaptogenesis. So, if it is new synapses are getting created, so you see the reflection in terms of the glucose metabolism. Now, this reflects a structure to function gradient, that is more synapse means more glucose metabolism. Now, the reaction as a result of which this has also been studied in terms of correlation or co-occurrence of this metabolism, higher metabolism reflecting higher number of synaptogenesis, higher synaptogenesis, as well as the correlation with the language related developments. So, based on this kind of findings, Bates and et al. Proposed a 4 layered connection interaction between the neural events and language learning. They call it readiness for learning, experience driven changes, rethinking of 2 postnatal correlates of language and the sensitive period. Readiness of for learning, we have already seen that the infant brain at birth is already up and running, it is already the connections are already in place. So, it is ready to learn, that is the idea behind this particular area, the particular stage of the correlation between language and neural activities. This is followed by the experience driven changes, which is also something we have already seen. Learning itself contributes to the structure of the developing brain in infants as well as in adults. We learn throughout our life and we make new connections in the brain, creates new connections, neuronal connections, synapses and so on. This is more evident in the case of infants. So, various experiences are found to profoundly impact synaptogenesis, though it may not be in the first part. We have seen the first part of synaptogenesis, which happens in the just before birth in 8th and 9th month of gestation, but the later parts of synaptogenesis may be dependent on the experiences. So, these are experience driven changes. So, findings from many studies, in fact, post mortem analysis of adult human brain that have shown a correlation between high levels of education and an increased dendritic branching in Wernicke's area. So, this is an example of experiences changing the neuronal structure itself. So, there is a direct correlation between experiences and the neural changes. And then with respect to the postnatal correlates of languages with respect to various kinds of neural structure. So, changes in the frontal lobe activity seem to coincide with the 8 to 10 month of watershed that we have already discussed. 8 to 10 month the time window is when a lot of activity in the frontal lobe happens, metabolism high gets higher, which is taken as a result of synaptogenesis, and this is also the time, the watershed moment where linguistic, behavioral and other changes happen. So, changes in synaptic density seem to coincide with burst in the vocabulary and grammar between 16 to 30 months. So, there is a parallel that have been proposed. So, these parallels between language burst as well as the synaptic burst may represent a mutually beneficial relationship, but it may not be a very crucial and direct relationship of cause and effect. That is not what they are proposing. They are saying that there seem to be a mutually beneficial kind of a relationship. Of course, more data are awaited, more work is going on in this domain. And last but not the least, the sensitive period. So, the critical period for language is used very often to distinguish between child language acquisition and second language acquisition or adult language acquisition. So, the idea of critical period is very crucial there, as we all know. So, under controlled learning conditions, adults and children, it has been found out, this is a very old study 78 and a very influential one, where they showed that adults and children under controlled condition in the beginning, they perform in the similar level in the early stages of second language acquisition. However, later stages of language learning may have may show differences. So, child may go on in the same speed, but the adults learning abilities may get fossilized, as they have talked about it. So, this kind of results do support the idea that there is an age related component in terms of the plasticity of language learning. However, if you look at a more deeper level, there are some differences. For example, not all linguistic abilities are equally affected by the sensitive periods. Some aspects of language, yes, but not everything. For example, the earlier decline is reported for accent free phonetic production as opposed to the various other kinds of grammatical structure. So, there are different kinds of time windows for different kinds of linguistic abilities. So, accent free production is one, but grammatical structure might have a different time window. Even within grammatical time structures, some of the structures can be learned even later, but some structures seem to be very difficult to learn after the sensitive period. So, this points to a series of gradients rather than a very strict time window, and this gradient might vary with the task difficulty level. So, the scientific understanding of this period is still advancing, we still do not have the final word. Data now suggests that an adult's difficulty in learning a second language is affected not only by maturation, but also by learning itself, because learning itself also changes the neuronal circuitry, as we have just seen. So, based on all these findings, Kuhl had proposed the native language neural commitment hypothesis. In this, they explored the relationship between the transition in phonetic perception and later language learning. So, this examined a critical test stemming from the native language neural commitment idea. The hypothesis is that the initial native language experience produces changes in the neural architecture and connections that reflect the pattern regularities of the that is imbibed in the ambient speech. So, the native language that the child is surrounded with, that creates a certain kind of a neuronal structure, which is committed to the native language. So, the native language and the corresponding neural architecture is what we are talking about here. Okay. So, the brain's neural commitment to native language pattern has a bidirectional effect. Neural coding facilitates the detection of more complex language units. So, first the neural coding happens because of the ambient the learning from the ambient language, and it facilitates learning of more complex words. Simultaneously, it also reduces attention to the alternate patterns such as those of a non-native language. So, while they are reinforcing the native language structures and the differentiations, at the same time they are also making them, this is why we see the perceptual narrowing, right. So, the reduced attention to the alternate possibilities, which are part of, let us say, all the other languages, not the native language. So, this works in a bidirectional format. So, this is also a developing domain. Of course, there are new evidence coming up, but this is another important hypothesis in this domain, where we are looking at language development with in respect to the neural correlates across different domains. So, not only the different stages, but also what happens during those stages and what probably gives rise to the neuronal structure. So, this is a two-way traffic. The language structure making changes, the ambient language making changes in the neuronal structure, and simultaneously various kinds of neural the various milestones of neural development having a probably having a correlation with the language related development that we see in the infants in infancy, the beginning, the first couple of years of the child's life. So, this is where we end our lecture 3. Thank you.